organized by the UNESCO Chair in Interdisciplinary Anticipation and Global Local Transformation under the lead of Roland Benedikter. Thank you all for joining us on this journey, and we hope you enjoyed it so far. In this edition, so far we've spoken about resilience, climate change, gender equality, peace and security, education to prevent discrimination and inequalities, and challenges to our democratic societies. And we would also like to take a moment to thank all our speakers who brought their valuable insights to this lecture series so far. And with this, I'll pass on to my colleague Chiara, who will introduce our speakers for the topic of this lecture today. How do we move on from here? Gaming as a practical approach for our futures.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So I will now introduce our two speakers for today. First, we have Roland Benedikter, UNESCO Chair holder here in Bolzano at the Center for Advanced Studies. At Eurac Research, he holds the UNESCO Chair in Interdisciplinary Anticipation and Global Local Transformation. He will give us a short input, about 10-15 minutes. And then our second speaker is Shermon Cruz, UNESCO Chair on Anticipatory Governance and Regenerative Cities at the Northwestern University in the Philippines. So Roland will start with a brief input, followed by a presentation of Shermon Cruz. And afterward, we will have an open discussion. If you have any questions, please write them as usual in the Q&A function or ask them directly after the two presentations. So now I will leave the floor to you, Roland.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chiara, for the kind introduction. Thanks, Shermon Cruz, for joining us to this lecture series. I would like to just give you a very brief impression where I think that we stand with futures thinking with regard to gamification. I think gamification is one of the major trends that we have today in the world, and I would give you a short framework why this is the case and why personally I am so fascinated by the rise of gaming in futures studies as it happened recently. I don't know if you can see the screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's fine.
Great. So what about gaming as a perspective in future thinking? The first question would be, why the gamification of futures? Why should we use gaming in predicting, anticipating, forecasting, or foresighting the future? Well, the introduction is very easy. I think we live in an age of acceleration, which is combined with an age of uncertainty. And that leads to a really high level complexity in our world when things happen faster, and if crises are occurring more often. The whole scenario can, for an average being, not be navigated by information alone, but needs some kind of additional instruments. And gamification can be one way to handle a complex world we are living in. And another reason is the rapid technological advancement of a time where we live in an always online culture, which changes the way we perceive the world, which makes many things more playful, but on the other hand, also introduces serious gaming. So experiments what would be if the world would be different in our daily experiences. And this is also an effect where gaming becomes part of futuring, but also of handling a complex world. And in fact, we see that this is happening. We are navigating to a world where we have 4 billion players, at least in the video realm, online, basically constantly in the world, which makes it half of humanity, which is playing to navigate their daily lives, not only as a joyful moment, but also kind of a need of digesting what they're experiencing. And we see this also in the numbers. Gaming has become a major factor in the world economy, more important than movies. We see that in 2024, as we speak, we have a size of 244 billion US dollars market size, which is expected to grow to almost 400 billion by 2029, with a growth rate of 10.17%, which makes it much more growth-oriented than most other branches of economic development in the world, with the fastest growing market, the Asia-Pacific, and the largest market, the Middle East and Africa. And it's very interesting that the so-called serious gaming, where we talk about applications that handle the concrete world consciously by providing education, by dealing with problems, by interconnecting people. The global serious market is just a small size of the global gaming market, but it is a notable size. It is around 4 billion in 2024, and it is expected to expand by a similar growth rate of 10.44 to around 8 billion in 2027. So this makes it a small but substantial part of the global gaming market. And now if we take out of this only the learning market, so global gaming that is dedicated exclusively to learning in the strict sense, we see that it is also a notable segment, which is stood at in 2018 at 3.5 billion, but is growing up to 24 billion as we speak. So we see the whole thing is growing. And why is this the case? Because in the end, everything we talk about or we anticipate about the future is connected in some sort to gaming. So for example, if the OECD here says in 2030, we could apply this also to some extent to 2050, there will be a world that could be divided in 4 scenarios or present one or more of these scenarios: a growth world on one hand, on the other hand, a sustainable world, a world of war, or a divided world. These scenarios are playful in the sense that they don't exist and must be tested by experience as far as this is possible. And a playful game is the best experience you can have about the future. All of the scenarios follow the basics of the foresight cone, which is you have to have a story baseline, you have to have limits of plausibility, which a game also must have. It must be realistic to some extent, and you have at least several futures in play, preferable futures, probable futures, or alternative futures. And this is exactly what you do with a game. You test several options. And finally, if we apply gaming to the learning sector, we see that the future of learning is connected with community building, with identity issues very strongly, with meaning, what is the meaning of society, of democracy, of myself, and with practice. And all these aspects, community, identity, meaning, and practice, are involved if I play a game together with others. So it's also an educational event. And as a result, we today speak of engagement design, and gaming is a part and has become a substantial part of engagement design. Engagement design means that entertainment and learning converge. The result is that you have better acceptance, you have more participation. In general, you have better learning scores. You have some kind of dialectics, which means different opinions. You have some kind of playful confrontation, and not least, you have also kind of competition for better futures. In essence, we can summarize all this in the sentence that games give us the opportunity to play with systems. They give us a safe space to embrace ambiguity and to take risks. So it's a risky endeavor without real risk former life where I can test different scenarios and opportunities without risking in reality, but making a similar experience as reality would give me. Now, the future of gaming concerns both design, schools, and civil society. And we have lots of gaming that is really in the experimental phase. And the next speaker, Shermon Cruz, is one of the most renowned experts in the world, in my view, who really deals with this issue, how to further develop gaming to make it even more contributional to good futures. Games provide more fun in experiencing futures, and they are to some extent physical, not only cognitive, which is a huge, huge advantage if you want to keep your concentration on a certain issue. And now what we see, and this is basically the effect, is that we have a lot of games that deal with futures who are springing up basically monthly. We have, for example, here the Futures Poker, where you can play cards imagining certain options in the future and how they relate to each other. We have the famous game, the Thing from the Future, issued by UNESCO, where we have different abstract scenarios that then fit together to give you an arriving space where you should imagine a thing that exists in that space. And last but not least, you have also games like Impact, which are more complex, which involve more issues. There are some games that resemble very competitive world games that try to conquer the world. Others imagine peaceful futures, and others again are more dedicated to sustainability as a crucial issue in embarking into potential futures. And we see that gaming is super effective, especially in the educational sectors. If you take this example, this is an application of the Futures game, the Thing from the Futures, with school pupils who then created scenarios to make them more three-dimensional. So gaming the future comes from the educational sector. It at the same time comes from the entertainment sector, but it also increasingly goes into the entrepreneurial sector, where technologies for intelligent voluntary cooperation are thought. And this is very important because people don't like to be commanded anymore. Games seduce them to participate voluntarily, and that's a super important issue, especially for the new generations. We have the Futures Explorer, and we have whole homepages now dedicated to games for sustainability, where it is about teaching, learning, and practicing sustainability through serious games. It is simulation learning, as we call it, and gaming is certainly one of the most effective aspects and approaches, tools to achieve this. It is about assigning leaderships if you play such a game. It is about critical decision-making points. It is about talking about the results, correcting each other with regard to the realism of what to expect. So gaming involves you into a creative process, which almost always leaves you different from whom you are before. And to conclude, I would refer to a very famous essay, which I highly recommend, to imagine the future of gaming, which is by Sohail Ianatullah, one of the grandfathers of futurism, and is called Gaming Ways of Knowing and Futures. And here, to summarize it very briefly, he says, the utility of gaming is in the fact that it makes the possibility of understanding futures more likely. It leads to greater insight. It allows for whole of brain, body, spirit learning. That means that all ways of learning are included. It allows cognitive faculties to be suspended while body catches up with future information, so to digest complexity, and it enhances the possibility of a more robust future. And the very important and last aspects I want to refer to in this essay by Ianatullah he says basically gaming is for everybody. So if you choose to game, to imagine futures, to enhance your imagination, but also to enhance your community building, you never go wrong. And he says we have basically 6 types of people who play games. The rule maker, who wishes to reduce uncertainty, is quite strict usually, and uses games as a way to increase productivity. The idealist, who is more focused on a desired version outside of today. You could rely to certain governments that are in place in Europe today who are very idealistic. There is the pragmatist, who sees gaming as a sideshow. I play, but I have better things to do, but doesn't note that he's digesting and evaluating things while he plays, at least subconsciously. There's the creative guy who is gaming for fun. There is the philosopher who believes gaming can be seen as trivial, but nevertheless always leads to some sort of insight, be it negative. And there's the collector who sees gaming as one more tool which is necessary in his array because he wants to have as many tools as possible. So all this taken together makes our claim plausible that gaming will be a substantial part of the future of future science, an increasingly important part to lure people in, but also to let them be concentrated, to carry them on in the creative process itself. And what I expect, and this is the last slide I want to present, is that the Summit of the Future, which could be really a turning point in the history of the United Nations, a first step towards the United Nations 2.0, scheduled for this September, could really present a huge infusion of gaming, a huge infusion of playfulness. And if it doesn't, we hope it does, that it upgrades gaming towards something serious in the global political and social process. And if it doesn't, it will need it in the coming years. So this was my short introduction. And now I give it to the expert that we have, which is Shermon Cruz. And Shermon, please go a little bit deeper than this very primitive and primordial framework.
Thank you very much, Roland. That was a wonderful presentation, and it's not really primitive. It's just amazing that you've been able to like some sort of put a context and overview about how gaming and futures are linked to each other. And particularly, I think when we do foresight, it's really about exploring and unpacking knowable, but also, of course, potential and possible scenarios from a preposterous or a preferable perspective. So, but before anything else, again, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful project. And for those who are joining us, thank you very much for joining us today as we explore an exciting and an emergent approach to futures thinking, which we called gaming. So while we often think of games, for many, many years as a mere entertainment, today, as far as futures and foresight is concerned, they hold immense potential to transform the way we do foresight, transforming the way we envision and shape collective futures. If futures thinking and foresight goes beyond the idea of the technical or the experts, and the fact that many foresight practice today subscribes to the idea of a participatory futures, that this gives us an opportunity and space to actually like make sense and reflect on the value of gaming in the way we do foresight today. So we will delve into how gaming, at least for my presentation, how it can serve as a tool for reimagining our futures, not just in the way we reimagine our futures, but also reimagining our approach to foresight, reimagining on the assumptions we make about foresight, reimagining the way we in fact challenge and see how foresight evolves in the context of gaming. So as we all know, of course, we've seen this and from many papers and reports that games actually challenges traditional thinking, and that it encourages creativity and it collaborates, future making. So the need for games has never been greater. If you try to look back into history, the demand, the dynamics, the market, the opportunities for people to actually play in different domains has never been greater in the last several years. As we've seen it, gaming offers a unique and by its nature and essence, it is an engaging platform. And today, as you see in the many Foresight games that has been introduced in the last 7 to 10 years of Foresight, is that we've been able to figure different ways of blending games with scenario development, particularly storytelling, and futures literacy as well, wherein we try to create different approaches through sandboxes, where we can stimulate creative ways in generating scenarios, simulating scenarios, not just about storytelling, but simulating the story as well, and developing ways by which we can actually make sense of them and make them useful as far as generating strategies are concerned, particularly for addressing the world's most pressing issues that we face today and in the next years to come. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. So if you can see from this slide, gaming and the future are deeply interconnected. Gaming not only reflects our visions of the future. In fact, we get to simulate them first by playing digital games. Is it enough? But it also actively shapes it. Games do shape our concepts and perceptions of technological innovations. It influences culture. It develops people's skills. It impacts the economy, as you've seen from Roland's presentation. That it is changing the way we transact, right? Like the idea of blockchain and cryptocurrency, in fact, was inspired by the games that was developed before that. It became a part of the systems that we currently use to relate in different ways, not just in transactions, in finances, but also in communications, right? Like your Facebook, your social media, Twitter, all the communication tools that we are using now. In fact, if you come to think about it, has been influenced by the games that we've seen over the years. So there has been an entanglement, in fact, between the future, the way we envision the future, and the way we developed and designed these games. So games, as I see it, will continue to advance and will remain a significant part of how we envision the future. It will remain a significant part of how, not just the way we envision the future, but the way we shape it, actually. So that entanglement with the futures can be understood, through the various aspects of foresight, right? We've seen that in the different frameworks that our colleagues, from the US and Europe and Australia, and we've been seeing that games, in fact, are changing the way we do foresight today in different ways, including the way we simulate this, futures by looking at, in fact, through some case studies like real world examples. So I'm going to give you some examples of how games and the future of how the future are evolving are actually entangled. Next slide, please. Like, for example, technological advancements, right? So the development of high performance graphic processing units like GPUs for gaming has paved the way for advancement in fields like artificial intelligence and data science. If you come to think about it, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, I was playing games developed by NVIDIA. And this NVIDIA GPUs that were originally designed for gaming are now used for AI research and autonomous driving technology. So those are, real world examples wherein, the initial intention was to develop games, to generate, highly sophisticated games, eventually would be used for, enabling platforms that allows us to build artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. Another example is that games like Beat Saber or Pokemon Go have popularized virtual reality and augmented reality, right, through our phones. And because of this, it led to the adoption in training simulations for healthcare professionals and augmented reality applications itself. So the initial expressions and manifestations of the technology that we have today, like AR, VR, in fact, were games initially. Next slide, please. And as games continue to explore complex, future scenarios, I would say that games will influence policy discourse and potentially, hopefully, guide policy making in the process in areas that are complex and not truly or perhaps understood at the moment because they are new to us. Like, for example, artificial intelligence ethics, space exploration, indigenous futures, and bioengineering, among other frontier technologies that we're currently trying to simulate, experiment on. Games would probably enable us to explore, the knowable, unknowable, preposterous, or preferable futures. So we play them first before, by playing them, by playing, like, for example, those different types of games, like serious games, it generates insights for us that you might not be able to generate by just, through text, through images, through tools and methods, or through philosophy, for example. So games could provide you, different ways by which we can, transcend ourselves beyond the things that we know. And of course, the scenario narratives that we derive from playing foresight games can prepare us for future ethical dilemmas, right? Making games, by playing it, it puts you in a low-risk environment, as a valuable tool for anticipatory governance and ethical foresight, which are pretty quite, particularly the ethics of foresight. And of course, one colleague and a UNESCO chair at the University of Lincoln, right, has been exploring this. Okay, what exactly is responsible foresight, right? So we use different framing, we use different approach in foresight to just explore these games. But what if we use play or serious games to explore what it means to be responsible in the way we predict the future, the way we anticipate the future? So as we move forward, the insights and innovations from the gaming world will continue to influence and define various aspects of our lives. And that would eventually impact and influence us on the way we perceive and imagine the future. So the concept of I play, therefore I am, is a twist on the famous philosophical statement, Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So this reinterpretation suggests that play and gaming are fundamental aspects of human existence and identity. It's always been there, right? And foundational to this view of I play, therefore I am, accentuates several things. One, that play is a core of human activity. It has always been there, right? It's natural, and it's an intrinsic part of, shaping human behavior. We've seen that in children, right, and adults like us. And it's not just a pastime, but a crucial way to explore, learn, and interact with the world, even before we interact with the real world. And it is also closely related and linked to the idea of identity and self-expression. I've seen this when I was a kid, when I was playing games. It started to inform and inspire me, and it gave me that idea of what the self actually was, and how you act, how you respond when you're faced with circumstances and situation. I've seen this in my 6- and 7-year-old daughter today, who's been playing games that are far more sophisticated and advanced than the games that I was playing when I was a kid. So if you try to study the games that kids are playing now, they're pretty quite high level, sophisticated. It incorporates a lot of domain of thinking and learning, right? And it's through play and games that we are able to express, our creativity and emotions. In fact, we cry, we laugh, and then we have fun. So imagine that the emotions that games generate, and we learn from them. So it simulates a lot of things, and it becomes a way to explore different facets of one's identity in a safe and controlled environment. But then, of course, we've been seeing a lot of some negative implications and outcomes of the games that we've been developing so far, right? It also leads to violence. It also leads to many things that questions and challenges us, that make us think about what exactly is moral, what is right, and among other things. So it is a constant evolution of knowing reality, as Roland has mentioned, using the work of Swahili and Inayatullah on ways of knowing the future, is that it is changing our conception and ways of knowing the future, given the complexity of games that are emerging today. And it was also mentioned about the cognitive aspect of it and the emotional engagement. So overall, play is essential for learning and development. And it often involves challenges, rules, and goals. Games can have a structure, and games does not need a structure, right? Sometimes games are finite, but then many games are infinite games, right? So if these are games that are infinite, the idea really is to give you a platform to generate ideas, at least in the context of generating idea, infinitely, perpetually, forever, as long as humanity exists, right? Games will enable us to actually challenge the borders of our imagination, the borders of our perception. And it opens up, opportunities for us to actually pierce those unknowable things. If at first the future must be ridiculous, as Jim Nader has said many years ago, then probably, games can enable us to better understand what he meant by it when he said that when we think about future ideas, it must at first seem ridiculous. But then the rationality and the logic in the way we do foresight perhaps prohibits and restricts us, to acknowledge, preposterous ideas, right? Absurdity, for example, in real world foresight. There is a tension between application and absurdity, really, in the way we do foresight. And probably through games, we might be able better to actually link and bridge, and resolve the tension between rationality and absurdity in the process of doing foresight. Next slide, please. So, of course, a play is considered by some philosophers as a fundamental way humans make sense of the world. It is a means of exploring possibilities, testing boundaries, and experiencing freedom within a structured environment. For psychologists, they view play as essential for cognitive and emotional development. It is a way for individuals, kids, and adults to practice real-world skills, process experiences, and explore different roles and scenarios. Next slide. So several, philosophers have actually explored the concept of games and play as a fundamental to human existence, emphasizing, the role that it gives us, enables us to understand the world, and experiencing freedom. Here are a few of the books, that has been published many years ago, like Friedrich Schiller. His key work was on the aesthetic education of men, right? And one quote that really stood out for me was that man is only fully a human being when he plays. And in that book, he believes that through play, individuals balance their physical, rational, and creative sides of self. And when you experience those things, you might be able to experience, what he called the complete self, by combining the physical, the rational, and the playful, right? So another book was, this is pretty quite popular, when as a reading, as far as literature review is concerned, when it comes to play, is the one by Johann Huizinga, Homo Ludens, a study of the play element in culture. He argued that play is primarily a necessary condition for the generation of culture. He introduced the idea of play element in culture, suggesting that many cultural activities, including law, war, and art, originated from play. So, quoting him, he said that play is older than culture. For culture, however inadequately defined, always presupposes human society. And animals, who also, they play as well, he said, have not waited for men to teach them their playing. So, and then one example, again, is by, Bozen, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. He explored the value of play in meta-communication. And we do this in foresight, right? We do a lot of meta-communication in foresight, right? And through play, it enables us to actually, provide us the space to speak at the meta level. Swahili again was saying about ways of knowing the future, right? Like the philosopher and those kinds of stuff that he shared with us through his essay, is that play enables us to actually immerse in epistemology, immerse in ontology without necessarily saying that, the conversation is about epistemes. What is essential is that when you play, it gives you a sense of reflective awareness, right? We know this, whether there are kids play or whatever play that is, there will always be a reflective awareness. And the impact, whether you are conscious or unconscious about it, is that, it comes back. And you will realize that the games that you were playing have actually, in fact, consciously or perhaps unconsciously influence your way of knowing reality, and the meanings, and how you understand these things. So, and then so many books as well. And what these philosophers are saying is that, play and reality are actually entangled with each other, right? There is no separation between both. And we use play to actually explore an unexplored experience. So next slide, please. And then as far as foresight is concerned, I would like you to check this website, the Better Versed website. It is a research project and toolbox developed by the Lucas School of Arts. It serves as a speculative space designed to train imagination and shape better futures. So the platform, this website, offers a range of games and processes to engage users in creative thinking and futures literacy, helping them, all of us who are interested into this, explore and address various societal change. Next slide, please. So the Betterverse website features a diverse library of over 20 speculative futures games designed to enhance futures literacy and critical thinking. So these games encourage players to explore potential futures, engage in collaborative problem solving, and develop innovative strategies for addressing societal challenges. Examples include, of course, as was mentioned, Karina, before, Thing from the Future game, Solar Punk Futures, Tarot Cards of Technology, and the Dreams and Disruptions game, which I developed in 2019. These games, and the other games offer unique ways of enabling people and participants, to envision and explore, complex systems and scenarios. Next slide, please. So integrating gaming mechanisms in foresight and scenario planning, enables you to leverage the immersive and interactive nature of games to foster foresight, to foster creativity, and participatory futures. So like, for example, the Dreams and Disruption games incorporates different elements of foresight, or perhaps those elements that we haven't incorporated in the way we do foresight. Like in this game, the Dreams and Disruptions game, incorporated, of course, traditional classical approach to foresight, those elements that we've integrated to build scenarios like time horizon, scenario archetypes, and forces of change, both megatrends and emerging trends, right? And then by playing these games, just by playing this game, it enables you to actually like build scenarios. And then, of course, incorporates other elements, like, for example, leadership. Like, how would your scenario evolve? Your scenario, for example, of sentient artificial intelligence evolve if it enters the mindset, using the lens of a laborer. How would artificial intelligence evolve when it enters the domain of the capitalist? How would artificial intelligence evolve when it is viewed by a general or a warrior? How would it evolve if it enters the domain of an intellectual? Or perhaps how would it evolve if it enters the domain of the spiritual, right? So it gives you the opportunity to look at, how scenarios could evolve when they enter different ways of knowing reality, whether you're a laborer, worker, a capitalist, or an intellectual, or a spiritual person. So it gives you the opportunity to actually like use their lenses by using these personas and mindsets, and just assimilate, these possibilities and fuse them in exploring alternative future worlds. Now, next slide, please. So, of course, as you play games and utilize them more frequent, as I've experienced, for like around 7 years of using games in the way I do my foresight practice, in learning, consulting, in different engagements that we have, including research, is that games enables us to captivate the attention of our clients, of our participants, of our students, of our communities, and draw them, to an immersive experience that enables them to simulate various futures. So the key here in games that are not necessarily, apparent in other foresight methods is that engagement. You tend to have a higher, possibility and opportunity to actually engage people and draw them while they're having fun, reflecting on deep learning and including the retention of complex concepts. I've seen this, through the games that I've been using. They can actually remember, these foresight concepts in the process. So another one is that, the scenario simulation, right? Like, so when we build scenarios, we do them either through textual or images. But then through games, depending on the type of game or scenario game that you're playing, it allows you to actually not just create the stories, but in fact, simulate the stories as well. So games enable you to simulate multiple scenarios. And it provides a safe space for everyone to think in absurdity. What I've learned is that people, in fact, have some reservations about thinking in the context of absurdity or preposterousness, or among other things, right? Joseph Vorus, who have developed the framework of which I've seen this in LinkedIn, right? Like many of us have been using the Voruscope or Joseph Vorus framework of potential futures or futures, was that he said that in fact the most useful in foresight as far as he is concerned is the preposterous future. Right? In fact, in the conversation that I had at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, there was a question, right? Like, what makes a brilliant futurist really, right? And the conversation led to us having a futurist that has the ability to think in absurdity that makes a futurist pretty quite influential and powerful. So the preposterous aspect of future, which in fact, I've seen this, is that when you go straight into the tools and methods right away, right? I've seen this, like, we've got a lot of scenario archetypes, many, right? And when we discuss them and then make them use right away, like for example, Jim Dator's alternative futures archetype. So the tendency, if they don't understood it right, is that the context becomes that, despite that they generate 4 alternative future worlds, the context of what they create apparently is just a default future is spread out into 4 alternative future worlds. So I tried to look into the scenarios that we've been building. I did a literature review of this, and what the insight that I got was, these are same scenarios. They're all default, right? But then they're just spread out into 4 alternative future worlds of collapse, transformation, discipline, and continued growth. But then the context really is just the default future, extrapolated into 4 alternative future worlds. So what Dator was saying as far as absurdity is concerned isn't there yet. The next insight that I learned is about the reframing phase and rethinking. It's hard to rethink. It's not natural for us to rethink. Reframing is not an easy thing to do, right? Like I've learned this in the Futures Literacy Workshop that I had in collaboration with Riel and our friends in the UNESCO Chair, is that it's pretty quite hard for people in communities and our partners, to think in a reframed context because it takes time, right? But then play, I would discover later on, is a much more provocative, entertaining approach, as a platform to enable people to actually rethink and reframe things without them even knowing it and realizing it. They wouldn't, but then the reflection that I've been seeing is that, they get surprised, to the scenarios that they're generating, and it's new to them what they've created, meant that it informs them, Shermon, now I know what it feels like to actually imagine things, right? And what I've learned from this engagement is that I would realize that thinking and imagining are not necessarily the same, right? Of course, thinking is based on logic. These are rational things. It has to be at some context, some contextual reality that we put into it to make these scenarios plausible. But then imagining is not necessarily a thinking process. Imagining is something that you draw on, probably on intuition, right? And through games and play, we might be like arts and music, we might be able to access the intuitional aspect of foresight, which apparently we've been struggling to actually, explore these things. And another thing that I learned was the insight about the way we do foresight in terms of, where does randomness come into play as far as we do foresight, right? We don't get to choose our crisis. In the real world, we're faced with complex stuff, right? What we do in foresight today is that we get to rank and choose our drivers of change. Is it enough? To make it plausible and understandable as far as our clients are concerned. That's fine. I'm okay with that. But then as far as emergence is concerned, it does not necessarily have to be always about determinate forces of change. My question, an insight that I get by playing game is that, what if our forces of change are indeterminate? What if we don't get to choose our forces of change? Like, what scenarios or futures might we be able to create if we don't get to choose our forces of change? What if these forces of change are random? What if these forces of change are not voted or ranked upon, but rather, through games and play, we do it randomly, right? And a lot of insights can be generated from that if we study, the context of play and games and foresight, and the essence, nature, and function and role of randomness in futures thinking. So, there are many ways by which, randomness exists, in fact, in games, like card games, right? Card games are pseudo-random, simulates the idea of pseudo-randomness, right? Cards, you don't get to choose your cards. You draw them without you knowing what exactly it is, right? And then with the cards that you have, you get to discern. You get to determine what's useful. You get to appreciate, and if games have winners and losers, you get to strategize and anticipate, the actions of others. So card games is a manifestation and an expression of pseudo-randomness. We've been struggling. In fact, I did a lot of literature studies on this, and what I've seen is that until today, we've been struggling to actually understand, really the essence and nature and usefulness of randomness. But we're learning. So next slide, please. So here's the thing as well, right? This came from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and I got this from his book called Anti-Fragility, right? He said in his book that complex systems are weakened or killed when deprived of randomness and stressors, right? And my question was do we apply these things in the way we do foresight? Yes, I would say, but not necessarily apparent and evident in the way we do foresight, because we end up concluding by generating scenarios. We don't stress test our scenarios. We do for some foresight practice. I've seen some cases in Europe and in the US and Asia as well, wherein we do stress our visions of the future. But then what if it becomes a permanent fixture in the way we do foresight, when we build scenarios, right? Disruptions or planetary existential risk and threats. So we just don't end up thinking about the preferred future or the preferable future, but we also stress test the preferred. We stress test the idea of transformation, right? So and then we might be surprised of what we might be able to discover and unfold if we stress test the weird future, stress test the preferred future, stress test the transformation future, among other things. We might be able to generate new types of archetypes in scenario development. So next slide. So here, some challenges and consideration. Next slide, please. Yep, I will end in the last two slides. So yep, I think I've been able to discuss that. I'm sorry. So next slide, we'll just go straight into, yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss this, but I just encourage you to show that these are the types of worlds that the Dreams and Disruption game was able to facilitate with different audience, right? So now some challenges and considerations here that you need to take note of when you're using games in futures or scenario planning and the other things that we do in foresight. One is accessibility. Right? Not all games are accessible to us. Not all games that the Better Verse has shown us, most of them are physical games. They're not virtual games yet, because developing virtual games are quite expensive. I haven't seen a fully developed foresight games, in virtual games. None yet. If you know something, let me know. So accessibility is an issue. So what we need to do is ensure that the games are accessible to diverse populations and culture, right? And accessibility is crucial for equitable participation. And we have to take note of the cultural context, because not all games are culturally sensitive, right? So we need to look into those things. Second, that makes foresight games fail or succeed, facilitation quality, right? So the effectiveness of foresight games depends on skilled facilitation to guide discussions and activities, right? So it's not just about the game itself, it's actually also as well the one who's facilitating the game. I think that is very important. Another thing is that I've learned that is balancing realism and optimism, right? In the games. So as far as I'm concerned, some might not have this kind of point of view, but as far as I'm concerned is that when we design and develop games, depends on what your intentions are, is that while the game encourages creative thinking, it is important to balance aspirational dream with realistic consideration of potential disruptions, right? So the disruptions when we use disruptions to stress test our ideas, it makes us grounded, really, right? Like while we think of fantasies, we live in the present, right? So when you try to fuse the fantasy part and the present and the disruptions that we're currently anticipating or probably living in, makes our ways of knowing possibilities culturally or perhaps politically, socially, economically, technologically, or spiritually grounded. It depends on what your intentions are. So next slide, please. Last few slides. Okay, next slide. So other than games, visualizations are important, right? So we want to capture the insights. We want to capture the dreaming, the narrative. You might invite in some artists in the process. So this is optional. But what I do when I play virtual games, if I have the resources to do so, I invite a doodler with me, right? So visualizations are very important. We know this, right? Like in futures, it's really about images. So by visualizing potential futures, fusing this with games, players and our participants can better understand the implications of different choices, different scenarios and actions. And this fosters forward-thinking mindset and adaptability. So beyond games, of course, images and visuals are always, an aspect of gamification. And of course, by using visualization, it enables people to actually better appreciate, and you could use them as leverage for innovative thinking. So now just to conclude this, the interactive nature of games encourage us, in foresight. While it is embedded in foresight, it requires us to think creatively. What enables us really is it gives you, a sense, a better sense, and an understanding of the need for you to consider diverse perspectives through games, leading to more innovative solutions if your approach is strategy development, leading to better understanding of our ways of knowing the future. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shermon, for this insightful presentation. Also to you, Roland, thank you very much for your input. Are there any questions? I saw that there are some in the Q&A. Please, if you have questions, you can ask them also directly with the raise hand function. So in the meantime, I think I will ask you, Roland, to answer the question you got. I will read now. Thank you, Roland, for a very insightful presentation about the future of gaming. I have a few general questions for you. How will technology shape the future of gaming? Second, will virtual reality become more popular in gaming? Third, how will artificial intelligence impact the future of gaming? And fourth, lastly, will the future of gaming be more inclusive? So if you can reply very, very short, because it's already 3 p.m.
Yeah, thank you. Very short. I would split the questions with and share them with Shermon. So I would take over the first two maybe, and you the last two, because they're too complex to be really answered. The first question, how will technology shape the future of gaming? I see the rise of technology in gaming with a laughing and a crying eye, I must admit, because on the one hand, you have wonderful scenarios to play on your computer, which really enhance the faculty of learning. So if you can immerse yourself, for example, in what we consider the golden age of the Greek civilization, 600 to 200, just by becoming a merchant or a soldier or an oligarch in a certain society, making all the experiences and taking the risks of daily lives as they were lived there, this is a tremendous advantage in learning. It is much easier, much more, much deeper reaching than learning just from information. So the more technological simulations advance, the better they are useful for deep learning by immersion. This is the positive aspect. The negative aspect I would say is that there is an overkill of very strong images generated by new technologies, which really suffocates and paralyze the imaginary. So what we would say is the more technology resembles reality, also in simulations, for example, in computer games, in first-person shooters or anything similar, you really lose the sense of what reality is because there's too much of it in a short time frame. So I would say technology will rise to more importance. This is inevitable, but I would limit it to certain circumstances because if it gets too much, it creates the opposite of what is wanted. The second question, will virtual reality become more popular in gaming? I guess so, but here this is the same problem. For example, I myself, I am very reserved against virtual gaming because I have not so good eyes. And if you have the newest studies, the more you have these virtual reality glasses, the more you lose your eyesight, or the faster your eyes get used up. So there's always a price to pay if technology advances in gaming, and nothing comes for nothing. If you have more realism or more immersion, you pay the price by the development of your brain, by the development of your senses, and by the impact it has on your cognitive faculties. So I'm always, and I don't know where Shermon stands, but I'm always for a balanced approach. I would never recommend to overdo technological gaming, although it can be useful, but always rely also on board gaming or other traditional forms. Shermon, can you see the third and fourth question?
Yeah, yes. You know, I will respond on the issue of inclusivity. I think that is a good question because, you know, it reminds me of the conversation that we had last year at the Asia Pacific Futures Network Conference, where the issue was about, you know, inclusivity in the way we do futures and foresight, right? And we had an engaging discussion about this, you know, about what does it mean to have an inclusive futures, and linking this now to games, is that, you know, games, them being playful and some serious, and most of the games that I've seen is that they're really like playful and fun. Is that when you play games, you don't really need to be future literate, right? Like you become literate by playing it. So other than that is that it can engage marginalized voices, right? And through games, by playing it, you know, people would invest, you know, effort on listening, you know, and playing, because when we play, when we play with others, we tend to listen to them. You know, we tend to hear their perspectives, and I think that is very important. You know, play can really, you know, put give us, you know, the opportunity and the, you know, the space, you know, to make foresight more inclusive and fun. And I think engaging marginalized voices is essential. Another one is that, of course, through games, it allows you for, you know, to have some sort of feedback loops, right? When you have feedback loops in foresight, it makes it inclusive. And another one, I think, is that as far as are concerned, you know, there are many games that were designed not to be inclusive. I think this is one thing that we need to look at. Like, for example, you know, how might we be able to, you know, how can we, you know, develop games that are inclusive? Like, for example, you know, the indigenous people, right? People with disabilities, like children, mothers, among other things, right? So, you know, it could be gender. You know, can we design games that makes our games more inclusive and ethically and culturally sensitive, right? Because, of course, while we develop games, we also have to be, you know, we have to look into the ethical aspects of the game that we're playing. I think that, or developing. I think that what you've said, Roland, you know, the ethical aspect of it, it has to be responsible as well, as much as possible if we could. And hopefully, you know, we can have a conversation about the accountability as well in the aspects of building games. And the last but not the least, to make it inclusive, is that you have to use accessible language. I think not just English; it has to be multilingual, right? Including whether they are physical, in-person, or digital games. We need to use accessible language.
Thank you so much. There's one other question, and I also want to let everyone know that we posted the link to the Betterverse in the Q&A. So if you want to visit the website, it's available in the Q&A. To Sherman, I'm a fan of dreams and disruptions. What have been lessons and insights you've learned and gathered from various play sessions over the last 12 months since you launched the D&D cards?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. One really, pretty quite obvious is they've been saying that this is divergent thinking in foresight, right? It allows people to think divergently, right? Like right on the spot from the very start. It's really about divergent thinking. Another is, of course, some ideas, insights from users and players is that, Sherman, what we realize is that we don't get to choose our crisis. No one really gets to choose their crisis. None, because these things are larger than us. It's not an invention of one person or individual. It's complexity, right? And connectedness. At the planetary level. Especially when crises are planetary in nature. They are beyond our control. Like, for example, the idea of a disruption concerning ocean system collapse. What if suddenly your ocean currents suddenly collapse, right? Like, what would the scenario? How would that affect your idea of blue ocean economies, right? Or probably studies in ocean sciences, among other things. Last but not the least is that I think this is pretty quite always stood out for me is, we get to realize the borders of our imagination, right? So when we're faced with randomness, when we're faced with forces of change that are not of our choosing, we tend to see, in fact, an invisible future, right? When you don't get to choose your forces of change, and suddenly you realize how important the invisible future actually is. That it's not just a rhetoric or a statement, but what does exactly mean for you to know and realize what exactly an invisible future is. And then one participant realized this, that he felt the borders of his worldviews. He felt that our ideologies collapse when we are faced with disconnected, unconnected, uncorrelated forces of change.
Jenny, should I take over?
Or yeah, so I just want to thank you both for the interesting discussion also, and the interesting questions we've got from our audience. So I don't know. I would like to thank all of you for joining us, not just today, but also for joining us and being part of the whole lecture series. And so now, I don't know, do you want to say something, Jenny, too? Then at the end, I wanted to share, or to invite Roland to give some closing remarks, maybe.
I think I'll just join you in the warm thank you to everyone to join us during those past 6 months and all the interesting topics we had. And also thank you, Sherman, for joining us today. And then I'll just pass on to you, Roland, for some closing words.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us today with this really excellent lecture of Sherman. Thank you once again, because this was truly enlightening. You also brought the deeper layers of what is at stake here, and I really appreciate it. But I also appreciate particularly, and this is where my main thanks go to all the speakers, but especially also to my team, Chiara Paris and Jenny Ufer, who did a superb job in organizing this lecture series. We had a really diverse range of issues. We tried to concentrate them, to focus on some specific issues. We focused on gender, we focused on issues of violence, of equality, and we tried to envision futures that still don't exist, which is obviously always, as Shermon knows better than we all probably, a quite risky endeavor. It is partly absurd. It goes to the unknown, it goes to the speculative. But I think if you go longer and with more patience into it, certain layers stand out. It stands out that resilience is built on preparedness. Preparedness is built on futures, on imagination, on variables that you add. And one of my main teachings, I must say, also of your lecture, Shermon, is the what if dimension that we really trained during these lectures. What would happen if, and here one of the things that we have to address in the future better is, do we have to ask this question only towards the future, or do we have to ask this question also towards the past? So what would have happened if, and I say this only because Chiara is a historian, and I often noticed over the past years that the best futurists are historians, and it is something that really makes me think and could be a final thought for the future of a lecture series. We certainly plan to continue this investigation. It is an investigation. It is not a mere presentation of results, but we are looking forward in something that doesn't exist. We are building scenarios, and we are so lucky to have some of the best minds of our generation as guests. For example, today, Shermon, whom I really thank again, and I thank you all for participating. I hope we see each other again in the next round that we are already starting to plan these days. So have a good summer. Thank you all, and see you next time.